Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about Russia's supply of natural gas to Europe. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, hang on a minute, didn't the supply of natural gas to Europe stop following the invasion of Ukraine? And on the most part, you'd be correct, because the main supply route, which was the Nord Stream pipeline, which was running under the Baltic Sea to feed Germany, was actually stopped, and subsequently that pipeline was blown up by a mysterious explosion. But there are still other pipelines that are supplying Europe, including two pipelines that run through Ukraine. And some of the landlocked countries in Europe are actually still buying large quantities of Russian gas because they haven't been able to find a cost-effective alternative supplier. However, Ukraine has now come out and stated that the 5-year supply agreement that was signed back in 2019 and expires on the 31st of December 2024 will not be renewed with Russia. And so Russia will no longer be able to supply the gas through that pipeline to those landlocked countries. And this is going to cause a problem for those countries, but it's also going to cause a problem for Russia, because Russia is earning over $25 million per day from the sale of this gas, which is more than $7 billion per year. So this is going to be another major hit in the pocket from Russia's perspective. So in today's video, we'll have a look at the Russian pipelines, and we'll look at those two pipelines that run through Ukraine that will be stopped at the end of 2024. We'll take a look at why Europe is so dependent on natural gas, how it's built its infrastructure to use gas, and which countries are still buying Russian gas at the moment. We'll talk about how those European countries are going to be able to source alternative supplies of gas and what the impact of this is going to be on the Russian gas business, because gas is not quite the same as oil. With oil, if you lose a customer, you can just find a new customer, put the oil on a ship and send it to them. However, with gas, if you want to send it in its natural form, you need to build a pipeline, which obviously isn't easy to do in the short term. So the alternative is to put it onto a ship. But in order to do that, you need to convert it from a gas to a liquid. You have to put it through a huge processing plant, which costs tens of billions of dollars to build. And obviously Russia isn't able to build those overnight. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of Ukraine announcing that it's not going to renew this transit agreement for Russian gas will be on the Russian economy and also on the Russian gas business. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. It really does help to keep me going. If you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or buy me a coffee membership, thank you for that support. Really does help to keep me motivated. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and the effort and the generosity. Really means a lot. Ukraine has now formally announced that it will not be renewing the 5-year agreement that was put in place in 2019 to allow Russian gas to be transported in the pipelines that run through Ukraine. And this is going to cause a problem not just for the European countries that are receiving that gas, but also for Russia, because Russia was earning somewhere between $7 and $10 billion every single year from the sale of that gas, which I think is quite surprising, because I think the majority of us assume that Europe is no longer buying any of this gas from Russia. However, the landlocked countries that sit at the end of those pipelines have been struggling to find alternative affordable supplies. So let's have a look at the details of the pipelines that Russia had constructed before it decided to invade Ukraine. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Incogni. Something that drives me absolutely insane is spam marketing, whether it be spam emails or spam text messages, or the very worst of all, spam phone calls, where people phone you up and try to sell you things that you've got absolutely no interest in buying. Now, the reason why you're hit with so much spam these days is because of data brokers. And this is a huge industry now. Data brokers can take your data when you go online and register for a store card or buy something, and then they can sell your data onto hundreds of different databases. And those databases are then used to hit you with all of the spam. Now, the great news is that if you can find out which databases you're on, you can contact them and have your details deleted. But who's got time to be doing that? Well, the answer to that question is incogni. Once you sign up with them, they will contact the data brokers and ask for your data to be removed. And as well as cutting out all of those unsolicited phone calls and messages, it will also protect you from cybercrime and identity theft. And the fantastic news is that Joe Blog's viewers can get a 60% discount on an annual plan by clicking on the link in the description below. This map shows a simplified version of the gas pipelines that Russia has constructed to deliver gas to all of the countries in Europe. And the main pipelines from top to bottom here are the Nord Stream pipeline that was constructed under the Baltic Sea to deliver gas directly to Germany, the Yamal pipeline, which was actually the first pipeline that was constructed to deliver gas to Germany and passes through Belarus and Poland, the Brotherhood pipeline, which was constructed during the Soviet Union era, when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and passes through the middle of Ukraine and delivers gas to Central European countries such as Slovakia, Hungary, Austria and the Czech Republic, and also Germany and Italy. The Blue Stream pipeline, which was constructed in 2003 and delivers gas directly to Turkey, and the Turk Stream pipeline, which is a second pipeline to Turkey, which was designed for onward transmission to southern Europe. Now, in terms of the current status of each of these pipelines, the Nord Stream pipelines are no longer operating. If you follow the channel, you'll be aware that explosions took place towards the end of 2022. These were underwater explosions that are still unexplained, and there hasn't been anybody that's come out and admitted responsibility officially for this attack. But the pipelines are no longer operating, and there was very little gas that was actually flowing through the pipeline at the time the explosions took place, because by that stage Russia had actually cut off Germany's supply. The Yamal pipeline is also no longer operating. Immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, President Putin came out and stated that all unfriendly nations had to pay Russia in future in Russian rubles. And Poland and Bulgaria both came out and stated that they would not pay Russia in rubles under any circumstances. And in response to that, President Putin immediately cut off the gas supply through the Yamal pipeline. And interestingly, the pipeline is now actually being used by Poland to import gas from Germany, because a pipeline is exactly that, it's just a pipe, and it can be used in either direction. So now that Russia is no longer feeding gas through its end, Germany is able to feed gas into the other end, and the gas flows from the south to the north rather than the other way round. The two pipelines supplying Turkey, the Blue Stream and the Turk Stream, are both operating as normal. If you follow the channel, you'll know that Turkey has maintained a neutral stance with regards to its position on Russia. Despite the fact that it's a member of NATO, it hasn't joined in the sanctions and is still buying large amounts of oil and natural gas directly from Russia. And interestingly, Russia recently put forward some proposals to Turkey whereby it would supply Turkey with gas, and that gas would then be sold onto Europe and badged as Turkish gas. Now, obviously, it's fairly obvious where that gas is originating from. However, that was Russia's proposal that Europe isn't really that keen on, because the whole point of the sanctions being applied against Russia are to stop the revenue that Russia is earning from its fossil fuels. So badging the gas as Turkish gas isn't really going to cut it. So therefore, the main pipelines that are now supplying Russian gas directly into Europe are the two pipelines that are running right through the middle of Ukraine. And these are the ones that are going to stop at the end of December 2024. And if you look at the countries that are directly in the path of this pipeline, it's the landlocked countries Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary and Austria that are having the most problems being able to source cost-effective alternative gas supplies. And they're the ones who are still buying large quantities of Russian gas on a daily basis. So why are European countries so dependent upon natural gas? Well, the reason for it is because they've built huge power plants that are generating electricity using natural gas. This map shows the location and size of the gas-fired power plants in Europe. So basically the large electricity generating power plants that have been built over the last 50 years. And the circles that we've got here represent both the size of the power plants and the amount of natural gas that they're using. So basically, the larger the circle, the larger the plant, and the darker the red, the more gas that that plant is using. So this map highlights the fact that Europe is totally dependent on the supply of natural gas for the production of electricity. And if you look at where the Russian pipelines end, that's the cluster of where all of the dependence has been built up in Europe. And so those landlocked countries that we just looked at, Austria, Hungary, Slovakia and the Czech Republic, are totally dependent on natural gas to produce electricity. And these countries have a really high dependence on Russian natural gas because they don't have any coastline, and therefore it's very difficult for them to be able to set up their own regasification plants to be able to turn liquefied natural gas back into its natural form and then feed it to its power stations. And that's really the crux of the problem for those countries, because what they don't want to do is force themselves into a recession by buying super expensive natural gas to replace the natural gas that was coming from Russia. This chart shows the current breakdown of gas consumption in the European Union. And what this shows is that 32.4% of all natural gas is used in power plants to produce electricity. A further 25.5% is used by households. So this is basically where natural gas is piped directly to people's homes and is used for heating and cooking purposes. And another 24.1% is used directly by industry. And the reason that industry uses natural gas is usually where it needs a lot of heat. So natural gas is a really good source of fuel if you're needing to raise the temperature of something, if you're burning something, or if you've got kilns or something of that nature. It's a very cost-effective way for industry to produce heat. And a further 11.2% is used in the service industry. And the reason I wanted to highlight this chart is to show that over 93% of all of the gas consumption is used for specific purposes. And these are going to be very difficult to replace because you can't just take out a power station overnight. You need to construct a replacement power station. And equally, if your country has built a network of gas supply, if that's what households are using predominantly for heating and cooking purposes, it's very difficult and expensive to get millions of homes to switch to another source of power because you have to change the boiler. If everybody's got a gas boiler, for example, you'd have to replace it with an electric boiler if you're using electricity. And so there's a big cost involved in that. And the situation is exactly the same in industry and the service sector. Once you've set up all of your infrastructure to use natural gas, it's going to be very expensive, time-consuming, and potentially cause problems to your business if you're forced to switch to electricity. And this is one of the problems that those landlocked countries are facing. They have a huge dependency on natural gas, and so they need to keep buying it from somewhere. And the cheapest form has been coming from Russia, and it's going to be very expensive for those countries to be able to find an alternative supply. Now, in terms of finding alternative supplies, the most obvious alternative is liquefied natural gas. If you can no longer receive your natural gas from a Russian pipeline, you can have it delivered on a ship to a regasification facility at the coast, and then you can feed it into your own pipeline and send it exactly where you need it to go. And this map of Europe shows the current regasification plants. And as you can see, all of these plants are located on the coast. And as I said at the start of today's video, if you have a coastline in your country that can accept ships that are delivering liquefied natural gas, then you can build a regasification facility very close, if not right at the port. That means that you can then convert that liquefied natural gas back to its gaseous form, feed it into the pipelines, and this becomes a relatively low-cost way of replacing the Russian gas supplies. Now, the other thing that's showing on this map is the location of all of the gas-fired power plants. They're shown by the orange dots all over Europe. And as you can see, there are lots of them all across the middle of Europe. And those countries in the middle that we've talked about, the landlocked countries such as Austria, Czech Republic and Hungary, are struggling to be able to find cost-effective ways to replace that gas because those countries don't have any coastline, therefore they can't set up their own regasification facilities, and so they're having to rely on other countries such as Germany, the Netherlands and Italy to be able to source gas on their behalf. But the problem that those landlocked countries are having is that countries like Italy and Germany are having to feed their own supplies first. They're also replacing what was previously being bought from Russia, and so they don't have a lot of excess capacity to be able to pass on to those landlocked countries. So this is going to prove a real problem for those Central European countries. This chart shows the source of all of the natural gas supplies for Europe in 2021, 2022 and 2023. And you can see on the right-hand side of this chart that the countries are labelled. So the bottom section, which is shown in blue on all three of these bar charts, is the supply from Russia. The next section is the supply from the United States. We've then got Norway, North Africa and then the rest of the world. And what this shows is that in 2021, Russia supplied around 45% of all of the natural gas purchased. However, in 2022, as a result of the invasion of Ukraine and the fact that a lot of European countries immediately stopped buying Russian gas, the total amount of gas purchased directly from Russia was reduced to around 23%. And in 2023, the amount of gas that European countries are buying from Russia has fallen to around 15%. Now, as well as that huge reduction in the supply from Russia, I think there's a couple of other interesting things to note about these tables. The amount of gas being purchased directly from the USA has increased threefold between 2021 and 2023. However, I think what's also important to note is that the total amount of gas being purchased by Europe has reduced. You can see that the 2023 chart is down by around 15% compared with what was being purchased in 2021 and 2022. And this is as a result of the fact that European countries are now trying to use other forms of power. And renewable energy is a big driver in Europe right now. They're trying to move away from having a dependence on fossil fuels like natural gas and becoming more renewable and self-sufficient. This graphic shows a detailed breakdown of the natural gas supply into Europe in 2023, and as you can see, Norway is now the single biggest provider, supplying around 30% of all of the gas that's being used. The United States is the second largest, providing just over 19%. North African gas provides around 14%, the UK just under 6%, and Qatar just over 5%. And the Russian pipeline business only represents around 9% of all gas that's being purchased today. However, in addition to that, liquefied natural gas that Russia produces is making up around 6%. So Russia in total is still supplying around 15% of all of the gas that's being used in Europe today. This chart shows a breakdown of Russia's fossil fuel sales in August 2024 by destination. And as you can see, the largest single purchaser is China, which paid over $6.5 billion to Russia in August. And within that amount, the biggest purchase that China is making is crude oil. Russia's second biggest customer was India, which paid around $3.5 billion to Russia. And the biggest purchase there was also crude oil. And the reason why China and India are predominantly buying crude oil rather than refined oil products is because both countries have their own refinery systems. They've built refineries which can process crude oil into all of the constituent breakdown parts such as gasoline, diesel and kerosene. And the reason that they want to buy crude rather than finished products is because it's much more cost effective. It's cheaper to buy the crude and then put it through your own refinery system. And also it generates employment and revenue in your own country because China and India can sell on those refined oil products to other third-party countries. Turkey was the third largest purchaser of Russian fossil fuels, buying around $2.5 billion in August. And interestingly, the biggest category that Turkey is purchasing is refined oil products like gasoline and diesel, because Turkey doesn't have a huge refining industry unlike India and China. Now, interestingly, number 4 on the list was the European Union, which paid over $2 billion to Russia for a variety of different fossil fuels. However, the largest category was pipeline gas. And if we now look at this chart, which shows which European countries were the biggest purchasers of Russian fossil fuels in August, you can see that Hungary was by far the largest, purchasing around $400 million worth of fossil fuels, and about 60% of those purchases related to pipeline gas and the other 40% to crude oil. Very interestingly, the second largest purchaser of Russian fossil fuels was France, which is one of the biggest countries in Europe and is applying sanctions directly against Russia. So it's surprising. And in August, France paid around $250 million to Russia for liquefied natural gas. Slovakia was the third largest purchaser, purchasing around $200 million worth of fossil fuels, and about 75% of those purchases related to pipeline gas. And Slovakia is one of the landlocked countries that we looked at earlier in the video. Austria was the fourth largest purchaser, purchasing around $200 million worth of pipeline gas. And interestingly, Italy, which does have its own coastline and its own regasification facilities, was the fifth largest purchaser, paying around $200 million for Russian pipeline gas. This chart shows the breakdown of Russian natural gas imported into the European Union by each of the different pipelines. And this chart dates back to the start of 2021 and goes through to the middle of 2024. And the different colours here represent the different pipelines. The light blue line represents the Nord Stream pipeline, which went under the Baltic Sea to Germany. The black line shows the pipelines that pass through Ukraine. The grey line shows the Yamal pipeline that goes via Poland, and the red line shows the Turk Stream pipeline that goes directly to Turkey. And what this chart shows is that in 2021, before the invasion of Ukraine started, the biggest pipeline that Russia was operating was the Nord Stream pipeline. Russia was selling around 60 billion cubic meters of gas to Germany every single year through this pipeline. The second largest by volume were the pipelines going through Ukraine, followed by the Yamal pipeline that went through Poland and Belarus. And in 2021, the Turk Stream pipeline came in at number 4 and was supplying significantly less gas than the other 3. However, if we now look at what happened during 2022, initially following the invasion of Ukraine, which commenced on the 24th of February, the Nord Stream pipeline continued operating as normal. Germany was still buying large quantities of Russian gas, predominantly because it needed to. It needed to keep all of its power stations operating to keep the lights on in Germany. And Germany didn't really have many other alternative options that it could switch to overnight. However, as soon as it did have alternatives, Russia decided to switch the Nord Stream pipeline off. And then the explosions took place, making the Nord Stream pipelines entirely redundant. And you can see that the supply actually stopped at around week 38 in 2022. If we now have a look at what happened to the Ukraine pipelines during 2022, you can see that there was a gradual reduction as countries started to switch off their supplies voluntarily. And by the end of 2022, the amount being supplied via the Ukrainian pipelines was around 25% of what had been supplied at the start of 2021. Now you can see that that supply has continued beyond 2022, and it's now a similar level to what's being supplied through the Turk Stream pipeline. If we now look at the Yamal pipeline, which is the grey line, you can see that in 2022 there was a rapid reduction in the amount of gas going through this pipeline. And as soon as Poland and Bulgaria came out and stated that they weren't prepared to pay in rubles, Russia switched off the gas supply and that pipeline became redundant at around week 26 in 2022. Now the red line on this chart shows the supply to Turkey, which has been relatively consistent throughout. However, it's operating at maximum capacity, so there's no real option of Russia being able to increase the amount of gas passing through that pipeline in order for Turkey to sell that gas on to European countries. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's really interesting news that Ukraine has decided to cancel a transit agreement for Russian gas for the pipelines that run all the way through Ukraine. Now, there is an argument to say, well, why didn't Ukraine do this as soon as the invasion started? Why didn't they cut off that supply of income from day one, rather than letting Russia still earn around 25 million euros per day? And I think the answer to that is that there's a very delicate balancing act in terms of cutting off all of the income that Russia is earning and causing major problems for some of the countries in Europe. And as we saw from the data earlier, the landlocked countries that are sitting in the middle of Europe that don't have easy access to ports and to the waterways, they're struggling to be able to find alternative suppliers that are cost effective, because anybody else that receives gas, so if another country who's on the coast is getting gas, they would then have to move that gas through a pipeline to get to countries such as Austria and Hungary, and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And those pipelines may not exist, or if they do, they're probably the Russian pipelines that need to be switched off and then start moving gas in the alternative direction. So I think from Ukraine's point of view, they wanted to make sure that some of the countries in Europe were still getting their supplies, because a lot of electricity in Europe is actually dependent on gas. Over the last 30 years or so, the European market moved towards gas as it was more environmentally friendly than coal. However, the problem was that most of that gas was coming from Russia. And so when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a real dilemma for a lot of these countries. They wanted to come out against Ukraine in terms of the big picture politics, but equally, they needed to keep getting supplies of gas to keep the electricity on, to keep all of their industry running, and therefore to keep their own economy buoyant. So I think from Ukraine's point of view, there were good reasons why they've allowed the transit to continue. But I think 2.5 years, or almost 3 years as it will be by the end of December 2024, since the invasion of Ukraine started, is long enough for these countries to be able to work out where they're going to get their alternative gas supplies from. So Ukraine have decided that enough is enough, and Russia will no longer have access to that revenue. And I think from Russia's point of view, the problems are twofold. Firstly, there's the loss of revenue, and we've calculated today that it's somewhere between $7 and $10 billion that they're losing on an annual basis, and that's a large amount of cash. So there's no question that that loss of income is going to hurt the Russian economy. However, I think one of the bigger issues here is actually what Russia is doing with its gas, because it's sitting on the largest natural gas supplies in the whole of the world, and it needs to monetize it. And in order to monetize it, it needs to find ways of actually transporting that gas to the people that want to buy it. And the network of pipelines that it built over the last 50 years have been a perfect way of monetizing that gas. And once all of those pipelines are in place, literally all Russia had to do was open up the pipelines, let the gas flow, and receive all of the cash. And that was a brilliant arrangement up until they decided to invade Ukraine. But the problem that Russia is now facing is that the majority of those pipelines are now redundant. They're not transporting gas. And gas is a very difficult fossil fuel to be able to do something else with, because in order to put it onto a ship and send it to places like India and China, you need to liquefy it. And building a gas processing plant is very expensive and also takes a lot of industrial know-how. You need expertise to be able to do that. And as we've talked about before, because of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has actually lost access to a lot of that expertise. Prior to the invasion, lots of multinational companies were operating in Russia. They were bringing all of their experts and all of the latest cutting-edge technology. However, they've now left, and Russia have been left to their own devices. So firstly, they've got to design and build these plants themselves. And then secondly, they've got to find a way of paying for it. And this is going to cost it tens of billions of dollars. And of course, when you're losing $7 billion worth of income immediately because that transit is no longer happening, and then you've also got to find $10 or $20 billion to build these plants, it becomes a really big problem from a financing point of view. Now, theoretically, Russia could turn to China and ask it to fund some of the development. However, what we've seen over the last 2 years is that a lot of the multinational companies that went to Russia and actually invested billions of dollars into things like those sort of plants have actually seen all of those assets being taken away from them. Many of them have been nationalized because Russia said it was in the state interest to do so. So as a result of that, I don't think China will be very keen on putting tens of billions of dollars into Russian infrastructure, because Russia could turn around at some point in the future and say, we don't like you anymore, China, therefore we're nationalizing all of these assets. So Russia is going to find it very difficult to be able to build those facilities, and until it does, all of that gas is going to have to remain under the ground. So it's not going to be able to monetize it, and that's going to hurt Russia over the long term. So we're talking about a 7 billion hit to the economy right now as a result of the loss of sales to Europe. But in the long term, it's a much bigger impact because Russia isn't able to monetize one of its biggest natural resources. So the overall summary of today's video is that Ukraine's announcement that it's not going to renew the transit agreement for Russian gas is going to hurt the Russian economy. It's likely to lose somewhere between $7 and $10 billion worth of revenue per year. But the bigger impact here is the ongoing problem that Russia has with monetizing one of its biggest natural resources. It's sitting on the largest supplies of natural gas in the world, but unfortunately, it's struggling to find ways to actually get that gas to people that want to buy it. And in the meantime, a lot of the world is moving on from fossil fuels. And by the time Russia gets to the point where it can start liquefying that gas, it might find that a lot of its customers are actually using renewable energies and don't actually want to buy it. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.